So welcome to Specially Designed Instruction. We're with Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative, the Special Education Regional Technical Assistance Center. And this topic this week is really around what do we do around specially designed instruction. And one of the reasons that we started with focusing on specially designed instruction is that teachers had some trouble with kind of really making a distinction between what is an accommodation, and then what is a modification, and then what is the specially designed instruction. So we're going to spend just a little time this afternoon working on that one. And so when we look at the law, this is the federal definition of what specially designed instruction is. And so this is what guides our work and helps us to make decisions about what we're supposed to do with students that's special because they've been identified with a disability. So, and I will just talk about that definition. It's that we adapt how things appropriately to the needs of that a child has been identified with a disability. So we look at content, methodology, and delivery of instruction. And we do that because we're looking at that unique need of that child. So in order for a child to be identified with a disability, they have to meet the eligibility criteria for the determination. They have to have they have to have an adverse effect. And then the third piece of that is that they need specially designed instruction. So they have to have all three of those things then to be identified as a student with a disability. And so we have to then, once we identify them with a disability, we have to make sure that they have access to the general curriculum. And so even though a child's been identified with a disability, that are not excused or not, that prohibit us from giving them access to the general education curriculum and the standards, it's in fact required that we still give them access, because we have then a lot more ground to cover and to make sure that we're not just giving them, if they're a 7th grade student and they read on the 2nd grade level, we don't always just give them 2nd grade material, because in fact they will be assessed at that 7th grade level. And so it's really important that we do that. So we think about specially designed instruction then as the way we teach them to move them as close as we can to grade level standards. So here's some resources. And so all of these resources are excellent things to help guide us when we choose specially designed instruction. And you'll see the IEP Lesson Plan Development Handbook is issued by the Kentucky Department of Education. And within that document, there are lots of resources that are available for you to look at. If a child has a disability in a certain area, then what is some of the appropriate instruction that we do special for that child? And so really leading that work is Ann Benninghoff and then Dr. Marilyn Friend. So both of those ladies are really leading current research and efforts in terms of special education, specially designed instruction. So those are great resources, especially when we think about what are some of those resources that are evidence-based. These ladies have the research behind that and the evidence behind that. So you are checking and using resources that are vetted. So on this one, let's talk just a little bit about those three big rocks with specially designed instruction. We have content. And so we have to give students access to the content. We have to give them access to grade level standards. And then some of our students who are visually impaired or hearing impaired have the expanded core curriculum. But again, that's making sure that they have access to curriculum and the resources that opportunities that they have. So we can never change the content. We can never change the standard for that grade level. We can, the only time it's okay to change the standard is if a student is on alternate assessment. And with alternate assessment, there's targets, and those targets reduce the standard by their breadth and depth, but that's specific just to those students who have been identified as needing the alternate assessment. So sometimes that's a little confusing, because we'll see that, again, for that example, that reading, if a child is at the 7th grade level, he's in the 7th grade, but he's reading at the 2nd grade level, they're still going to be assessed with 7th grade standards, but we have to figure out then the skills that they're missing all the way back down to 2nd grade in order to help them catch up. And when we think about that, that's part of what we think about when we help write a goal. We look at their present level of performance and we see where they're currently performing at. And when we write that the IEP goal, we're looking for a year out. what's the way for a year out, what do we think that we're going to be able to do in order to move through that content? And again, we're still looking at that grade level. The other thing then is the methodology. And here's where we really get into the opportunity to change our method, the way we deliver and teach students. So how we deliver. So if we're very explicit or if we're very direct in the way we teach students, because what we know is the traditional way or the way that we've modeled or provided examples for them through our methods, the way we teach, if it didn't work for them, right? So here's opportunity to have some teacher creativity and to use some research-based strategies when you're teaching. We use a lot of the explicit instruction model, and that is with Dr. Anita Archer, and that model allows us that to I do, we do, you do, which means that we very explicitly teach students. So that's one method that we can use when we're thinking about they need step-by-step. They need models and examples and access to manipulatives and things like that. So those are opportunities that we have with specially designed instruction that we can use there. And then we think about the delivery. And so sometimes we give kids a paper and pencil test, but are there other ways that we can have, that we deliver the instruction and then how kids can access it? So I'm going to stop right there for just a second and let you take a look at this, this image. So for this image, we think about the universal design for learning. And I always think about it as a cake. You know, I think about these tiers and these layers of support that kids get. And so we hear that word UDL, or the universal design for learning. And what universal design for learning says is that all students, if we open the learning opportunities up and we design lessons for students that have this universal approach, and we think about the way we deliver instruction, how kids access information, and how kids then get to respond, all kids should get that. And so that's the bottom layer of the cake. That's really what every student should get. We know that's part of our core instruction. That's where we plan the teaching and learning. Then we move to the differentiated, right? So we stack another layer on there. And that, when we start to differentiate, then that becomes much smaller groups. That becomes tailored to those student needs, much more specific. And then we move to tiered instruction. So that's where tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 occur. And that's how we move students, right? Again, we decrease the group size, and we increase the intensity and the frequency of how we provide them research-based interventions. So all of these happen before specially designed instruction. So you may have a student with a learning disability, for example, in reading. But they have not been identified with a learning disability in mathematics. If that's the case, then we still think about that tiered instruction for those students. So just because they have a disability in reading doesn't mean they have one in math. So we continue to provide tiered instruction for those students. So we're going to talk a little bit about the difference. So we did some research here at KVEC with some teachers, and we found out that there's a little bit of a misconception about what specially designed instruction is and what it is not. And again, we've continued to share that information through professional learning opportunities, our conferences, those kinds of things, because we just want to correct those misconceptions. So we can adapt content. Now remember, we don't change the standards, but we can adapt the content. We can change the way the method we teach, and then how we deliver the instruction. So it is not those same things that we just talked about. It's not universal design or UDL. It's not differentiation. It's not accommodation, and it's not modification. So for example, if I give a student a graphic organizer, well, that might be an accommodation to help them organize their thinking. It doesn't become specially designed instruction until we teach them how to use that graphic organizer. For example, in writing, we might use a raft, R-A-F-T, and that is an organizer. Then you have, that's the role, the audience, who you're writing for, what your focus is, and if you remain on topic. So if I teach a student how to use that organizer, then that becomes specially designed instruction. If I just give them that, it's not. And so people get confused sometimes on that. So that's helpful to remember. So that when we go back to that, we talking about adapting content, and when we think about that, we don't change the standard, but we change the pieces of that. And what we mean by that, adapting the content, we still look for that real critical skill. And I use this example all the time. In fourth grade reading, kids have to be able to infer. And if they can't make inferences, which our students with disabilities have a very difficult time with making inferences. So if kids can't infer, then we have to back up and see, what is it at third grade they need to be able to do? What is it at second grade? And I always use that example because in second grade, kids have to know and be able to ask things like who, what, when, where, and why questions. And those are building their capacity then to be able to make inferences. So I'm still teaching them how to get to inferencing, but I'm backing up third grade, I'm backing up to second grade, and I'm teaching them a strategy. So then I may use a graphic organizer that says who, what, when, where, and why, and I teach them how to ask those questions when they read a piece of text. And then eventually I'm going to fade that away, and then I'm going to move them to being able to ask those questions, mentally, or they use metacognition. And then by the time, then I'm going to keep working with them. And by the time we remove that away, they're going to be able to make inferences based on text. And so that's a good way to think about it. So we're moving students based on skills. And so we can change that a little bit as far as the skills that we're focusing on, but we're always trying to get to that grade level. So the other thing is, and you'll see this at the bottom of the screen, we're talking about this is how we teach students. And so lots of times when kids we have students pulled to the resource room for time to work on their IEP goals. Sometimes teachers want us to pull them and work on homework. And that's not specially designed instruction, right? That's just additional homework help. So when we think about, we have this obligation or their civil right. Right. So if we say that this child has an IEP and is in need of specially designed instruction, then it becomes our right. I mean, their right and our obligation to make sure that they receive that. And so the way we do that is the way we can change the way we teach them. And so if you'll see, can we use groups? Can we use some problem solving strategies? Can we use brainstorming? Can we use technology? There's all kinds of things that we can integrate in our lesson that helps kids. Think about how you could use more visual supports, or you could use number lines, or you can use hundreds charts, or you can build models in mathematics. If you teach them strategies and give them opportunities to practice, and then you feedback them. Those are all about how we teach students that's different than the way they receive that initial instruction. And so as special educators, we have to remember that, and we have to follow that because of that obligation and civil right. The next thing then is, how do we deliver that? And so again, that's back to that same notion about we have an obligation to deliver that instruction, and that is their right. So we can adapt the way we deliver. And so we may think about pacing, right? What's the pacing for that? So if our students have a disability, then we know that maybe when we look at their assessments and we see what their cognitive score is, and let's say we see that a child has their working memory index they have a low working memory index, or it's significantly below their peers. So working memory, which means they're having trouble holding or remembering things holding that in their head and being able to recall it. So we have to think about the rate of how we're delivering information. So we pull them, or we have them in a resource room in that environment where we can go much slower. We can give them examples, work slower, and give them opportunities to respond and give them feedback. So pacing is really, really important. We also thinking about processing speed. And if you think about the assessment, those are 5 areas that we assess students in. Processing speed is another one. And if you've worked with students that takes them just a little bit longer, then that's what we think about. Are we allowing adequate time for them to process? because sometimes they just need some extra time, right? So maybe that's why we give them some extended time. That's why we give them some extra time in the resource room. The other thing is, if we work with kids in a much smaller group, we reduce that ratio, that teacher-student ratio, and we give them many opportunities to answer questions, even at that slower rate. And then we check their responses. And if they're making errors, then we correct misconceptions. We teach, reteach, we model through different methods, like you can give them sentence frames, or you can give them working with multisensory tools in reading, like in phonics, or when you're thinking about phonics instruction in letters and sounds. What are some of the things that we give them? We give them concrete models. We give them uh, to, tools that they can use. We can give them bead strings. There's all kinds of things that we do in that instruction. And then we give them that feedback immediately. And what the research says is the students who struggle the most need the most opportunity for practice turns and feedback, and they generally get the least amount. Because if you think about in a classroom, when students raise their hand, if the teacher calls on them in a general ed classroom and they expect students to answer, and most of the time it's not the students with disabilities that answer those questions. It's those good students who are doing really well and know the answers. And so generally those students answer most all the questions. And the kids who are maybe that have a disability can opt out of that, right? And they don't have to respond. So that's why it's so important that we spend that time very specific and tailored with working with that student. So we look at the standards that they have to be able to do. We pick out the skills that they need to work on. It could be main idea, it could be inferencing, it could be numbers, it could be one-to-one correspondence, it could be numbers, it could be geometry, it could be fractions, whatever the skills that they're missing. In mathematics, it could generally be adding and subtracting, multiplying and dividing. But we look at the skills that they're missing and what they need to be able to do. And then that's how we start writing our goal. We look at what is that area of deficit and what can we hope for them to be able to do in a year. And then we write a goal. So we're going to say that this student's going to be able to accomplish this in a year. And then we'd have to choose the specially designed instruction. So what matches that? And so when you develop an IEP and you're working on that goal and you select from that drop-down menu about the what kind of specially designed instruction they're going to need, think about that. Just pause and think about, will this delivery of instruction or this specially designed instruction help this student be able to attain that goal? And if sometimes those don't match. And so when you think about that, especially as a new teacher, you have to think, just pause and say, does that make sense? Does it match what I said in the present level? And does that goal align? Is it appropriate? Is it rigorous enough for that child? Does it meet their need? And then how am I going to teach them? All of those things are all important. So that's how we really connect that piece between the compliance and the IEP to the academics. We know, through that present level, we look at their data, we consider their assessments, their psychological, we look at their adaptive behavior, we look at their academic performance, and all of those help guide us. Then we take that information and then we have to drill on down to find that skill, right? So we take the annual, reevaluation or the assessment data, we find areas that they need to work on, then we drill down in that skill, and then we find out where they're at. So when we're writing that present level and that baseline, that really comes from drilling down to that skill, picking out what they need, where they're at, and then you design your instruction around that and write those goals. So it really is connected. And sometimes it's kind of disconnected because we see the paperwork sometimes and then what we do with the teaching and learning, but it's really all driven by the same thing. And so we're checking their progress all along the way. So if I'm teaching a child in mathematics and I'm using number lines and I'm helping them, it's a first grade student and we're using manipulatives and we're using number lines. And I use number lines and I'm going to check, right? Because that's part of our IEP goal too, is that we have to check to see how well they're doing along the way. And I check and it's not really making a difference. I'm not going to wait that whole year to change my instruction. I'm going to change the way I teach that as soon as I have enough data to show me that that kid's not making adequate progress. So that helps me to know when and how to design my classroom instruction, and then it connects back to my progress report. So again, it's all connected. So we just have to think about what is it that that child's deficit, where is that child's deficit? What is it that that child really needs in order to be successful? And, if it's working memory, then maybe you could work on some memory strategies. There's some things that you could use in the resource room, but, you might give them visual cues. You might give them organizers, but it all should make sense about what we do in terms of what the disability is, the area that they need help in, and how we teach and the learning that occurs along with that. So we start thinking about, this one is just talking about when, in terms of what administrators need to know. So what are administrators looking for when they visit classrooms in terms of specially designed instruction? And then what's happening in that instruction in the classroom? And so they're going to be looking around lesson planning. They're going to be looking about what kind of intentional instruction is happening. So if that's in your resource room, what do your lesson plans look like? How are you planning for specially designed instruction? How are you being very intentional about what that student needs? Are you using evidence-based strategies? And is the work guided by the Kentucky academic standards? And so I'll give you an example. So there was a student, we were looking at a folder, and that student was in 6th grade, and that student was still working on phonics in the 6th grade. And so when we looked at the 5th grade, when he was in the 5th grade, he had an IEP. In the 4th grade, he had an IEP. The 3rd grade, he had an IEP. And every year, he was working on phonics. So as 2nd grade, he worked on phonics. 3rd grade, he worked on phonics. 4th grade, he worked on phonics. 5th grade, he worked on phonics. Now, so we're saying in 4 years, he didn't make any progress. So we're continuing to use that goal. Now, if we think about that, if he is in the 6th grade, what is he going to need to be able to do at the 6th grade level? And we have to think about that, because if we just are using the same goals, it's not ambitious and it's not rigorous. So that becomes a compliance issue. So really understanding the standard and how that standard is designed, it gets harder and harder every year. We call that the cognitive demand, but every year the standard gets a little bit harder, a little bit harder, a little bit harder. And so as special ed teachers, we're kind of tasked with figuring out how to break that down backwards. And where do we start and what do they miss? But we're always driven by the standards, and we always use the data. We have to check to see where they're at. And you'll think about your progress reports and how you collect data for your progress monitoring. And if you're working on comprehension and you bring the students in the room, you have them read a comprehension passage and you check their comprehension. Did they answer those questions, right? During the time you're teaching them. So maybe you're teaching them a comprehension skill. Maybe you're teaching them how to think about their own thinking, or you're teaching them a skill about how to find important ideas, or you're teaching them how to summarize text. But all along the way, you're choosing strategies to work with them to help them to be able to read and comprehend. And so, in the same thing, when you think about a co-teaching classroom, you have the same thing. You think about through specially designed instruction, well, how does that look like in the co-teaching classroom? Because in the resource room, it might look a little different. But if you have all the students and you were working in there with a regular ed teacher and you have to do that specially designed instruction, how's the best way to do that? And a lot of times that comes through small group instruction, and that can become through the co-teaching practices, right? And the research behind them says one of the most effective co-teaching practices is station teaching. So if you're working in stations, you can provide that specially designed instruction to students in that small group. Again, just keep in mind or always remember that the most important piece is that we are teaching students, so we're using a special approach because that's what makes it special. It's in addition to what every other kid gets. It's in addition to universal design for learning. It's in addition to differentiation. It's in addition to tiered level of support, and it's different based on that student need. And you know that student need because you are using data from their evaluation, their benchmark assessments, their interim assessments. You're looking at their MAP data. There's some MVPA data, I think, that's the case data. So there's all kinds of pieces of data that you have. And then you got a screener Maybe you've done a reading, a quick phonics screener or a phonemic awareness screener. So all of those things, but that's where your data comes from. That's what helps you decide what to teach and how to teach that. And if you'll see that down at the bottom, we're teaching them because we want them to make progress. When we accommodate them, we're getting them access. And if you remember that, that'll help you kind of make sure if you're doing what you're doing is specially designed instruction or if it's accommodations and modifications. And we appreciate you being here with us today.